Part 2. In part 1 of the series, we looked at how, although rhythms in music can be a pretty big and complicated topic, it can be a lot easier to learn if you think of it like a board game that has a set of base rules, as well as different sets of expansions to add new dimensions and possibilities to the base game. These concepts can be much more approachable if you tackle them in smaller chunks. So far, we covered some crucial definitions and concepts. Make sure you're comfortable with these things because the next expansion really builds on these concepts. It's called Subdivision, Into the Quantum Realm. As you already know, everything relates to the beat, which is the underlying sense of pulse in a piece of music. So far, we've been dealing with notes that are 1 beat or longer. But you can also have notes that subdivide the beat, like 2 notes per beat, or 3, or 4. In musical notation, you already know that whole notes are equal to and break down into 2 half notes, and half notes break down into 2 quarter notes. And now we're going to subdivide the quarter note into 8 notes. 8 notes can look a bit different when they're shown one at a time versus several in a row, but they work the same otherwise. A bar of 8 notes will be counted 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and they can occur on any beat. And they work the same way in other meters too. And I'll just take a moment to say that these rhythms and notation are a bit denser than what we've seen before, so feel free to pause the video or review any example if you want to take a closer look at the rhythms we're counting. Here's an example that might be familiar. And you can mix and match 8 notes with all kinds of rhythms. Here's an example in 3/4. Rhythms with single 8th notes can have the effect of emphasizing notes that are off the beat. This is known as syncopation. If you have trouble with these types of rhythms, just imagine subdividing and counting everything into 8 notes. These two rhythms are exactly the same because of the added ties, but subdividing everything into 8 notes can make it much easier to understand what's going on. You can also have 8th rests, which are another way to achieve syncopation. Now that we have notes that are a beat and half a beat long, we can have notes that are a beat and a half, either with ties or with a dotted quarter note, but they're all 1.5 beats long. The dotted quarter is probably the most common way to show a beat and a half, but these other versions make the dotted quarter easier to understand at first because they show what's actually going on. Something you should keep in mind about dotted quarter rhythms is that they actually take 2 beats to complete. I know that sounds a bit counterintuitive, but imagine you were eating pizza, but you're pretty hungry, so you actually feel like eating a pizza and a half. You need 2 pizzas to get the job done. You eat that whole first pizza, and the extra half comes from the second pizza. With dotted quarters, you need to get into the second beat before moving on, and that can be a lot clearer if you subdivide the rhythm and notice where the notes fall in relation to the beat. That's about all there is to know about 8th notes, but we can also break those down into 16ths. They're half the length of 8th notes, and they also look a bit different if they're shown one at a time or in larger groups. A bar of 16th notes is counted 1 E and a 2 E and a 3 E and a 4 E and a. Here's how they sound on each beat in 4/4. And of course, it's the same in other meters too. Music with 16th notes can look really dense at first glance, and while 16th notes can be really fast, they can also be medium tempo. And 16th notes can even be kind of slow. It's kind of like how 2 can be a little or a lot. It all depends on the context. So don't be intimidated by music with 16th notes and worry about playing really fast right away. The process is always basically the same. Just figure out the notes, then the rhythm, then put it together and bring it up to tempo. You can combine 8th notes and 16th notes in a few ways. There's an 8th and 2 16ths, as well as the opposite, 2 16ths and an 8th. Or you could put the 8th in the middle of the 2 16ths. And you can also combine 16ths with dotted 8ths in 2 combinations. 16th rests look like this, and they can make for some pretty tricky rhythms. But if you can group the notes into whole beats, almost like grouping the pizza slices into whole pies, it should help you work out the counting and figure out how to perform the rhythm. 16ths can be mixed and matched in all kinds of ways with other rhythms. Here's an example of the possibilities. You can also break the 16th note down into 32nd notes, which are half the length, and you can continue that pattern into even smaller subdivisions. But honestly, you hardly ever see anything smaller than a 16th note. There isn't even a standard way to count 30 seconds. You just need to understand that each note value can subdivide into 2 equal halves. These smaller subdivisions just get really cumbersome and difficult to read, so they're not used too often, and 16ths are usually fast enough anyway. Not to mention the fact that it's barely possible to say demi semi hemi demi semi quaver with a straight face. Also, just listen to this nonsense. You may see these from time to time. Some versions of Bach's Air on a G string, which is a pretty famous piece, do include 30-second notes, but the tempo is so slow, it's not uncommon to see it written this way, with doubled note values and tempo. And actually, that's a great way to figure out tricky rhythms. By doubling the note values and the tempo, maybe even more than once, you'll have a new version that sounds the same, but is much easier to read and count. And there's another type of subdivision called a tuplet, which is a non-standard division of the beat. The most common being the 8th note triplet, which divides the quarter note into 3. Some people count them 1 and a, while others prefer triplet. Either works as long as they're evenly spaced out. You can also have quarter note triplets, which fit 3 beats into a half note. And 16th note triplets fit 3 notes into the space of an 8th note. Those are the most common types of tuplets, but others are possible too, and they all basically mean fit this many notes into the beats allowed. In the previous video, we talked about pickup notes, which come before the downbeat of a phrase. But you should also know that you can have subdivided pickups, and you always count them by working backwards from beat 1, just like in Happy Birthday. Or Brahms' Lullaby. There's also a space opera theme song. And of course. And pickups don't even have to start on a whole beat. This one starts on the end of 3. We've already used ties in a few different ways, mostly to make notes longer, but one of their most common uses is to make certain subdivided rhythms easier to read. These two examples sound the same, but the top one is generally preferred because it more clearly shows where beat 3 is. It's not nearly as clear in the other version. Here's a more extreme example. It's really not easy to see where the beats fall, even though it might seem that way. Now this is definitely a tricky rhythm, but at least with this version, you can clearly see all the downbeats, which makes it much easier to count and figure out how to perform. And it's also quite common to see ties connecting subdivided notes over the bar line. And that's basically all you need to know about subdivisions. It'll probably take some practice to get really comfortable with all this, but fundamentally it's all just based on the beat and a few different ways to divide it, most often into 2, 3, or 4. When you see a tricky rhythm, just go slow, phrase by phrase, beat by beat, and work your way through it. What we've covered so far sets you up to play lots and lots of music. In the next video, we'll be looking at what happens if there's a different number other than 4 on the bottom of the time signature, which opens up even more options. And then we'll move on to swing and a bunch of other interesting rhythmic possibilities. Be sure to subscribe and enable notifications to make sure you don't miss it. And if you have any questions about rhythm or things you'd like to see covered, let me know in a comment below. Thanks for watching.